my story, it's not necessarily a life-saving device. We come to find out there's baggage associated with the device technologically or technically, and there's also the baggage of navigating the American healthcare system. So it's really a distinctly American story in that when I first pass out in that parking lot, I'm uninsured in the year 2009 before the Affordable Care Act had been passed. And then later in the book, when some other medical drama unfolds, I'm actually on an Affordable Care Act plan. And so I come to navigate the inside of the system in a particular way and understand how that policy is actually operating, including trying to get care at a moment when it's possible the Affordable Care Act could have been rescinded. So it was 2017 when Congress was voting a lot on repeal and replace programs. But then the book is about something much larger than that. This question of like, what makes a device life-saving? What does it mean to save a life? I'm gonna read from the prologue, which I think helps set this up. But one of the things that has occurred in my body in relationship to the device is that in 2012, while playing intramural soccer in grad school, I ended up taking 3 shocks to the heart unnecessarily. And it was at that moment that I really started to ask the question of, what is this metal in my body? Where did it come from? What does it carry? What stories am I attached to on the other side of the world? And so what does it cost to use a medical technology like this, not just for the individual within a healthcare system and experiencing the potential baggage of the device that we don't talk about very much, the things that can go wrong, but also what does it cost in terms of environmental and social costs on the other side of the world. And so part of this book includes me traveling to mines on the African continent. I go to Madagascar, I go to South Africa and Rwanda, and I'm really looking at what are those stories that I'm connected to? And when we think about saving a life in the US, what does that actually add up to in a more global sense? Sorry, I'm getting so washed out.
That's okay.
It's been snowing all day here in New Mexico, and suddenly the sun is out, which is a very New Mexico thing. So yeah, ultimately that's sort of the synopsis of the book, and it does all come together at the end, but you can see why that's been a large undertaking to sort of sequence the personal story of my own body and health with this much larger story of what it means to pursue my health through technological means. So do you want me to read that passage now?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Sure. Great. So this is the prologue. These are the first pages of the book, in case anyone's tuning in that hasn't read it yet. Prologue, Tucson, Arizona, 2012. Nothing can prepare you for what it feels like to be shocked by an implanted cardioverter defibrillator. Like a badly spliced film reel, my memory of the night is fractured. In one instant, a player on the other intramural soccer team had fallen and the game stopped. He was getting up, brushing his thighs. In the next, my hands became claws. A maul cracked open my chest with a sickening thump, a hot whip tearing through my back. Did somebody kick in my spine? And then I knew, and I was screaming. There's no way you wouldn't scream if you felt it, my sister had said. By then, the defibrillator had been in my body for 3 silent years, resting loyally above my left breast, keeping watch for the arrhythmia that could send me to the ground unconscious, with a heart quivering rather than pumping blood. Now, on a crisp November night in Tucson, Arizona, I dropped to my knees in time for the second shock. What if it doesn't stop? I knew something was wrong, either with my device or with my body, but probably my ICD. If it was an arrhythmia, I should have been collapsed, unconscious, not sharp and alive like this, staring at the backs of houses at the edge of the field, their kitchen lights spilling dully out the windows as I screamed. Call 911. A third shock. You can either scream or breathe, a voice inside me said, and I began to pull in air, cold, heavy breaths, the way I'd learned to breathe into pain in yoga. I am either alive or dead, and I choose which. The device did not fire again. Can I get someone behind me? I called out. I don't trust myself not to fall. Someone cupped my back immediately, supported me to the ground, and the sky came into view. A ring of faces, the sharp white field lights, the smell of burning, which was me. There is a kind of dream state that settles over the body in these moments, a clarity that rarely visits us when our lives are busy unfolding. For lying on my back, looking at the stars, a question lodged itself in my brain, a wild constellation of if-then statements. If the defibrillator just saved my life, if a defibrillator is just metal, if metal is mind earth, if children sometimes work in mines, if tunnels collapse, if warlords profit, if women are raped, if mountains are dismantled and made toxic. If mind earth just saved my life, was it worth it? The thin branched burns that uncoil from the heads and necks of lightning strike victims are sometimes called lightning flowers. Fern-like, following the patterns of rain or sweat, they are rose-colored lightning bolts frozen onto the body, as beautiful as they are terrible. I will never know what my insides looked like after 2000 volts. If my tissue erupted into lightning flowers of the body cavity, a sudden bloom. What I do know is that the night I took 3 shocks to the heart, I was marked, called into the world in a way I could not turn away from. What can save us, I would learn, never comes without cost. Some people say lightning strikes cure blindness. This is my version. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was so good. Yeah, when I first read that, I instantly am like, oh, what a, that's the hook of the beginning of the book. But when I started reading this, I didn't realize how young that you were at the time when this happened, because your sister was like 19, right, whenever she first found out. And I think you kind of touched upon this, but and then you find out later, and I don't know, just such a young age. And then I noticed that throughout the whole story, you have such detail in writing, and this was 10 years ago. Can you talk about kind of how that process started? Did you keep notes, or were you a journaler, or those sorts of things?
I love that question. Yeah. I've been a writer since I was really for as long as I can remember, but I first articulated it when I was 7. And so I think as soon as I woke up in that parking lot, I understood that I was living a really big story, and that anything I kept track of would be gold. At the time, I was a poet and a fiction writer. And so I couldn't have conceived of, especially writing a book with this much research, like becoming a reporter and reading all these white papers and trying to like synthesize findings about like how wires break inside the heart, right? Explaining all these kinds of concepts. All of that is like very much the product of my late 20s and early 30s and some like very hard work. But the way I'm built more naturally was being attuned to narrative and being attuned to place in particular. The tagline on my social media handles says, the real work of the poet is to make the language of humans more like the language of the land. And I really started writing out of this kind of devotional love song to land. And I think you can tell that throughout. So yeah, I was a very deep journaler for most of the years leading up to the medical trauma. There were certainly parts of this book where I couldn't write as much, and I often was just taking down like little scraps of sentences, like not even real narrative. Mm-hmm. But some of the passages from early in the book are lifted directly out of my journal. And I'm so grateful that I was the kind of self that doing that, literally like having the phone call with my first cardiac surgeon's nurse, in which she advised me to fake cardiac arrest and come in through the ER. Like I was literally writing with a friend when I had that conversation. So I sat right back down and got the dialogue line for line.
Oh, wow. That's wild. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that actually, because you kind of struggle with trying to get insurance, because at the time, if you had a pre-existing condition, it was very difficult or almost impossible in a way to get insurance. And so you knew that you needed this device, and I'm kind of summarizing, and you're living in Colorado trying to get insurance. And then the nurse tells you, well, if you go through the ER, then they might write it off a little better, and they code things. And I thought that was wild to me that they gave you that advice. How did that make you feel kind of at the time? Were you like, oh, can I do that? My thought instantly was, you fake a cardiac arrest. Yeah.
I am not a good liar. I mean, I hope you can tell by the vulnerability of this book that I have a lot of investment in honesty, but also I just like can't compose my face. So yeah. What was really striking about that whole period of time was this tension between systems that did not function and individuals who had learned how to navigate the dysfunctionality and who were willing to sort of put themselves on the line and usher me through. I mean, part of that conversation, as you read in the book, is her saying like, I never told you this, which of course, like, you know, it changed her name, but had to wait till the station was up on anything. And I have wondered a lot if I were not, you know, an upper middle class white woman who was well educated, whose sister was already a patient of this surgeon, you know, like, would they have gone to bat for me in the same way? The surgeon ends up donating his fee. He gets the anesthesiologist to donate his fee. He works with St. Jude Medical to donate my first device. And so out of the estimated out-of-pocket cost was $180,000. And I probably ended up with 22 that I paid over time. And then my father helped me when he got an inheritance from his father. So there's a real way that like, I know that privilege plays a role in this story, in the way people sort of tour guide me through what they've learned about the system. What's interesting about the end of the book is that individuals also play this key role because the systems aren't working. But in that instance, they're not going to bat for me. You know, they're not sending the paperwork where it's supposed to go. They're not remembering to call on my behalf or calling me back or whatever it is. And so I really have come away from this sense of the American healthcare system as a roll of the dice in some way based on who you are and who you get at the front of that counter and how their day is going. And
yeah,
it's unnerving. It's unnerving.
Well, yeah, because in your story, you know, in your timeline of your health, you visited different cardiologists in different states who all kind of told you something different or would have advised something different. And I think everyone's kind of experienced that, unfortunately, in their health journeys, where you talk to one doctor and then you get a different explanation or something like that. And so I don't know. I know that you did do your research quite a bit into, like, especially the Mayo Clinic when you started to attend there. And yeah, no, I thought about that too while I was reading your story, was the level of privilege that sometimes we are allowed to have. And, you know, I thought someone who didn't have, you know, much money or resources, it's, you know, and you have great family support, which I wanted to ask you about that too, because part of this is kind of your sister's journey.
Yeah.
Her
when you're talking about the details from 10 years ago, you know, one thing that's worth saying is that she gave me the gift of a lifetime in understanding that even though it's my right to tell my story and no one would ever push back against that in my family, she really could have made herself a more, not that she can be a minor character in this story exactly because of like what happened, but you know, she was allowing me to text her and be like, okay, so when you went to that party after your first heart surgery, what were you wearing? Do you remember what the apartment looked like? How were you feeling? Who else was there? Like looking for the little details. You know, if you look at that section, she tells me how she kept taking her arm in and out of her sling because she like felt so awkward and ugly wearing the sling in this party full of cute blonde girls. She was a surprise girl and had just had all these friends who, you know, were dressed to the nines, and no one said anything about the fact that she had just had heart surgery. No one asked her how she was doing. And so there was this sort of occupying of two worlds. And I understand as a writer that the places that illness stories tend to feel too plotty or play by play, they sort of lag. It's because there's not enough. I mean, part of it is structure, but part of it is the way we keep the world animate, that we're not just in the world of like technical diagnostic terms, that we're in the world of a woman who has heart surgery at age 19 and then has friends who don't ask about it and has to figure out what to wear to a party. That's like the lived experience of illness. And I think I'm from Illinois. And so there's a particular way that part of the Midwest just doesn't talk about things, and how that relates to the illness experience. I mean, I think it's true of the US in general, but I would be curious if it feels as acute for any of the folks who live in your area, just the way that those experiences get buried. And I wanted people to feel really seen by this book. And so asking my sister, I think, was painful for her because she doesn't dwell on it in the same way I do. She has not dedicated her life to like processing all those stories back through her body and trying to make them legible for other people. So for me to ask it was a big ask, and she really showed up for me.
Yeah, she definitely did. Well, and I thought how interesting for you to almost have someone to talk to who's had a shared experience, because you were both kind of going through it around the same time and age to a degree, as a young person. Like, and you mentioned a lot of times in the book when you were in a cardiologist office, you were the youngest person in the room.
Yeah, and so it was a great pleasure to get to go together when we could.
Yeah.
Yeah, she, what was I gonna say? I just had a total brain fart. What was I talking about? Oh, what's interesting in the book is that I really, in that year, in 2009, 2010, I really needed her to show up because no one else in my life had been through something like that as a young person. My parents obviously were not the right people to like process my potential impending death with, because
Right.
my parents, and like very invested in sort of, that's not going to happen. And I didn't ever get connected with a mental health practitioner. And it was like too heavy, too intense for my friends, and my partner really burned out on it. And I felt like Christine should know. Christine should be the one who can show up, and really couldn't see, she was still younger than me and had never processed her experiences. And me having those experiences forced them back into her face in a way that our bodies like dissociate from trauma or ignore things for a reason, so that we can survive them, so that we can keep moving. And that's a great short-term strategy, and it's not always a great long-term strategy, but that was still in the very short term. And it's funny because she has apologized to me for not being able to show up for me in that period. And then in the process of like finishing the book and putting it out, I actually had to come back and apologize to her. Because when she first started going into cardiac arrest and had a heart surgery at age 19, I was, doing my own thing 500 miles away in my cabin teaching skiing. I did not ask her what her experience had been. It was sort of like, oh, that's fixed, right? And so it was scary at the moment, and then it was over, and she wasn't going to bring it up. And I realized how I had really failed her first. And so one of the gifts of the book, in us having to have these conversations, and her having to fact check her sections and really like see some of my experience that maybe she didn't know, we now have just a really extraordinary bond. And you never like want that kind of relationship if it has to come through both of you almost dying and becoming cyborgs, but I'll take it.
Yeah, well, because at 20, that should be the thing that's the farthest from your mind, is I might die. That's where you go a little crazy and you think you won't. So, it's an interesting experience all the way around. One thing I was going to ask you was about your parents. Was this like a difficult thing for them to kind of relive too? Because they were a big part of this story as well. They're very supportive. And
that's an interesting it's an interesting wording. I'm not sure either of them experienced it as a hard thing to relive.
Okay.
when I was in high school, my older sister, who's barely in the book because she wasn't really interfacing with our heart stuff much, but she gave me a t-shirt that said, "Careful or you'll end up in my novel." And so I wore it on the morning of book launch, and all of us just died.
Oh.
Because in some way my family has always predicted this. I think they thought it would have been sort of a fictionalized version of our family until I went off to school to write nonfiction. But yeah, it's not exactly a surprise. I would say they certainly, when we were going through our fact-checking process, there was certainly some back and forth around, I think, their anxieties of how people might view them and whether or not, you know, I am very, I try to be really in my integrity about how I build portrayals of people. And I'm not here to pretend things didn't happen that happened. I am here to like create enough context that we can view people as full human beings. But I think they both were nervous being written about for the first time. And my dad's comments were very much along the line of like, wow, all these things that I had totally forgotten. I mean, I think one thing that's been interesting for me to realize in the context of my family is that the writer brain is different from the not writer brain. That like I really do live in the story of our lives in a different way. I'm cataloging things and returning to things and processing them. And you know, people have busy lives and they're not always reflecting kind of as much as you have to be a writer. So some of the stuff that happened with my dad in the hospital. There's a touching scene where he shows up unannounced. I am septic. I may or may not have a blood clot in my lung, so I've been readmitted. And he shows up with a book of Shel Silverstein poetry and Ken Burns's documentary on the Dust Bowl. And we like watch this documentary in my hospital room and eat Thai food. And I am haunted by those days. You know, I will never forget the details of some of those encounters. And he did. Even it's not that it's not precious or terrifying for him, but I think there is really a different sensation around like, oh, right. And so they've really had the experience now that I'm pleased they got to have. There are a lot of people in their lives who've reached out to say, we had no idea. And even people who were like our neighbors in Illinois, so they knew like, oh, Judy's going back to the hospital to be with Katie. They knew, but you don't know. And so I think it's been really gratifying for the whole family that the vulnerability of this story opens a space to have different conversations with people that we've known for a long time who may actually have experiences that are more similar than we think, and just nobody's sharing out of that kind of Midwestern, like quiet.
Yeah, like don't bring it up type thing. Well, and that goes back to just like the human memory. We all remember different things. You know, siblings will remember the same event very differently, or you know, it depends on the person what their brain thinks is the thing they should, you know, remember, and cherish, and that sort of thing. So that's really interesting.
And I should say that some of the details did come from interviewing them. So they were a part of the process throughout.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed the scene or that you described of him coming to see you, because he was just so worried because you had gone into sepsis and he was just so unsure and he had to see for himself. And I thought that was very sweet.
Yeah.
I did want to talk some about like your worldwide tour to try to figure out where your defibrillator came from. I truly will be honest, I didn't know anything about defibrillators till I read this book, and then I did my own research because I was curious. But I think you kind of touched on this before. It is, I won't say it's just American, but it's very human of us to not think to save my life, what all happens to this, you know, in the process of building this defibrillator, you know, how does this affecting the places where this is sourced and everything. And I found that really intriguing. And I wondered, you know, as a librarian, research wise, really difficult to figure out where is this titanium sourced from, where are these wires made. I was curious about your process with that. And if you could just talk about how you came to those places?
Yeah, that was a really long process. So I took the shocks to my heart on November 11th, 2012, which is fun because the book came out on November 10th, 2020. So almost an exact 8-year alignment. And because on that night I started thinking about like, what are the metals inside me? You know, the prologue makes a little clear, but chapter 3 makes even clearer that when I first got shocked, the thing that was sort of top of mind for me was conflict minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which that was like a huge issue in 2012. There ended up being legislation passed about it, both like folded into the US's Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation, and then also in Europe, there were some conflict mineral specific legislation. So the business community was talking about it. NGOs were really working on it a lot. And so it had clearly landed in my head at some point before I was shocked in a powerful way that that's really where I began. And so I started trying to work on this question right away, really as a matter of survival, as a matter of like, what is inside me? And how do I relate to what is inside me? And if I'm beginning to question for the first time whether or not I should actually have this thing inside me, whether it might hurt me more than save me, yeah, it just felt really morally urgent to try to track that. So one of the things I did was I drove up to the St. Jude Medical Factory in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was living in Tucson at the time, so it was only about 2 hours. And there was this wonderful engineer who was willing to meet with me for a few hours. Med tech companies love meeting patients. They don't often get to at these manufacturing facilities. So I also was welcomed at the Silmar plant in California. I don't know that they knew I would end up with a book deal. So I've been a little on edge, like, oh, am I going to get myself sued somehow? But, you know, it's memoir. And I did go. So yeah, I talked to that engineer and he was showing me sort of the insides of these defibrillators that were on his desk. And we were able to talk through like, okay, those are gold wires thinner than human hairs. And these ones that look like tiny solar panels are this. And then I also spent a lot of time on the phone with the St. Jude Medical Engineering team. They have like a patient line you can call, and they often wouldn't give me specific information, but sometimes they would tell me like, I would say, is this in there? And they would be like, no. We sort of rode the line of trade secrets. They don't want to give away their secrets. Also, like, really, I can't like build a competing defibrillator based off anything they told me. I did find a consultant online who had worked for multiple companies and wasn't under as strict a like gag order. So he was able to kind of list things out. So through that process, I came to understand that the likelihood that I could trace something specific was basically nothing. Like that was not going to happen. The Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation that included a little conflict minerals rider, Section 1502 is what it's called. Section 1502 requires companies that are listed on US-based stock exchanges to determine in their products whether those products contain gold, tin, tantalum, or tungsten, essential to the functionality of the product that comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo or adjoining countries, aka places the mineral could have been smuggled out. And for those who aren't familiar with conflict minerals, the basic idea is that there are forms of mining that can be done just with guys with shovels or people in the river panning. You know, most of it's industrial now, but there's still a lot that's available in the Congo specifically that is very low tech. And so warlords were able to, that area has a lot of conflict for many reasons, and it's been in civil war for over 20 years. Some of it began as a result of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, but there are a lot of sociopolitical factors there. And so it's not that there wasn't conflict there before there was an electronics boom in the US, but personal electronics, all of our laptops, all of our cell phones made those minerals worth a lot of money. And that made it worth it for armed groups to take over those mines. And then they used them to fund themselves. So that then creates a situation where they can terrorize local communities even more. So Section 1502 requires companies to determine whether or not their products have, they refer to them as the 3 TGs, gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. And for companies to figure that out was almost an insane proposition because of the way our global supply chains work. So as I was watching companies respond to 1502, I was like, oh, okay, there's no way St. Jude Medical, even if they wanted to tell me, there's no way they can tell me, like, yes, the nickel in your device comes from here, and the cobalt comes from here, and the titanium comes from here. And so it became instead this question of like, what are the potential stories that I could be linked to, which I think is actually more meaningful because it's not just about the one device. You know, by the time I finished the book, I was 2 devices later. And other people may have this device, or they might have a pacemaker, they might have a neurostimulator, they might have an insulin pump, or they might just be carrying around a cell phone. And so there's a way in which a larger inquiry actually reflects into our lives, I think, in a more powerful way. And so I started really looking around at like, okay, conflict minerals is maybe like the worst case scenario. What are the best case scenarios? And I read a ton of mining websites. I got really down the rabbit hole of corporate social responsibility and like what that looks like and what the standards are that govern projects that are receiving awards. Like, what does it mean to do this well? And then I had this moment of incredible emotional resonance when I got to the Umbatubi nickel and cobalt project in Madagascar. And part of it was because it was so new. And so it was something that could really exemplify the things we'd learned about mining over the previous decades, from human rights abuses to environmental standards. Like, what does it look like right now? Like, this project is going to be a better way to take that temperature. And their social corporate responsibility report was so impressive. I was like, I felt like I was swooning. It was like, this is so great. And then I was like, okay, like, it's very glossy. I wonder what people in these villages actually say about this company. I wonder what it actually looks like. And so that was the beginning of like, can I get there? How do I get there? And then once I'm there, what is it I even want to do? It can seem so easy when you read a book like this. And I appreciate that as a librarian, you see the different layers of research that are at play. It can be so easy to be like, oh yeah, she just went to these places. But of course, I went to so many other places and all these other things were happening. Like, I don't know, the taxi driver who ended up not being trustworthy, or like I ate something and so I was super sick and I was like, do I include that in the book? You know, I met all these people who sort of told me things off the record, and like, how do I deal with that information and make it a meaningful part of the book, because it was important. So yeah, then being there was this whole other thing. And of course I was reading kind of as much as I could on mining on the African continent, environmental impacts of mining and human rights, global supply chains, and circular economies. So I really had to become this giant iceberg in order to take readers for a tour of the different tips that show up in this book. There's a lot more, and I just have to sort of like know that it was necessary.
I mean, I feel like that could be a book all its own, you know, that's
legitimately.
Yeah, I think, you know, in reading it, I really enjoyed, I don't know, that pulling together of like, this saves my life, but what is it affecting in the long run? Like, what's the ripple effect of building these devices that save people's lives, when in turn, you know, the titanium and all these things that they're mining to create it are ruining the economies of these small countries that are supplying it. And, you know, and I think, you know, I think Americans in general are not super great at thinking about things like that and how our waste and whatnot affects things. And so it was.
Yeah, well, we love life-saving language. You know, we think of ourselves as so, you know, Americans are kind and Americans are magnanimous and Americans are helpers. And there's this whole underbelly to our consumer experience. And I think there is a little bit of an awakening around, okay, how we live our lives shapes the planet, but there's not much of an awakening yet around how we relate to death shapes the planet too. And one of the choices I made was not to write a lot about other types of medical waste necessarily, or the way American healthcare is in part so expensive because we spend a ton of money in the last few months of people's lives. Like there's a great book called The Good Death by Anne Newman that I drew on a lot in my own thinking. I'm trying to think of who else. Being Mortal by Atul Gawande, of course, is one of the most important books in this realm. But they really are starting to ask the questions like, how do we view the end of life in a way that is nourishing? Like Americans are so focused on like prevent death, prevent death, prevent death, that we forget that we're all actually going to die. And it's not that we're saying like, yes, allow death to take otherwise healthy 24-year-olds, you know, like that's straw manning the proposition. We don't have to go there. But on the other hand, there is a way in which, like, when we say, what does it mean for me to be alive? And if I know I'm going to die anyway, what are the kinds of trade-offs that seem appropriate? And if we're going to use resources to keep me alive, can we use them in a way that acknowledges how sacred they are, that they are that important, and that our lives are that important, that we're going to allocate some resources, but we're going to be conscious of the allocation of resources. We're not just going to like, we're doing everything and like sort of out all these resources and run up huge bills in our healthcare system. And that person was going to die anyway, and actually might have had a nicer time dying at home with their family with some hospital support, right? And so all of that sounds very remote when I'm the one talking, because I am the otherwise healthy, 24-year-old, 30-year-old, 35-year-old, at whatever stage we're talking about in my story. But one of the things that my journey really did to me was force me to see at all times, like, oh, you thought you prevented death that way? How about this way? Like, it still could be coming all the time. And so what does it mean to be a person who loves the land? What does it mean to be a person who wants to look in the eyes other people who are losing access to their ancestral forests, or whose health is impacted by proximity to a mine, but who aren't benefiting from it in any of the ways that we like to tell ourselves as Americans that they usually are? Development as a term is very similar to the way we view technology. We really love these ideas, and it's not that there's not promise in something like development or something like technology, but it's not monolithic, and it has to be very carefully executed, and sometimes it's not the right thing to do. And when is it the right thing to do? And that's really what I see at the heart of this book.
Yeah, our own immortality as a price, that's kind of an ongoing theme with humans in general, just the idea that we have a problem with that. We're going to die one day, and we don't want to, that's.
And it's not that we have to want to, right? But we lost at some point, and I maybe should research more into when this happened. We lost the cultural ability to support each other in that truth. Like that's a brutal part of being a human, and I don't like it either. And I've spent a lot of time in proximity to death, and I can tell you it's not fluffy. It's not, I'm not welcoming it exactly, but I also know that nothing grows in a garden unless there's compost, unless there's a fallow period, decomposition, rotting. The relationship between cycles of death and cycles of life is really important, and something that a lot of cultures hold in their rituals and their stories. And we don't really have a place for that, because we're very focused on the new, the innovative, looking young, staying fit in a particularly narrow sense of the word, not allowing that realm of how does decay lean over into fertility? What does it mean for things to pass and to welcome the new and really honor and usher out what is on its way?
Yeah. We do have a question for you. Matthew asked, out of the 8 years from the original shocks to the book's publication, how much of that time was spent on the writing, how much on living life, and how much on seeking publication? Was it a struggle to find an agent and sell a manuscript to a publisher?
Oh, there's so much in that question.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple eras in the writing of this book, as I think Matthew sensed. The first era was that the book was sort of born conceptually while I was in grad school as a Master of Fine Arts creative writing student at University of Arizona. So I entered that program in September of 2012, and I knew I was going to write about what had happened in 2009 and 2010 and write about the device and write about my sister, but I didn't quite know how. And when I took those shocks in November 2012, that really focused the question. And so then I was writing the illness story, but I also was really doing a lot of the initial research of this project. And then came the horrible moment at the beginning of part 2 in this book where my device signaled to me that it had low battery. And that for me was a real warning shot of like, do I make a decision as a writer right now to write the book about the things that have already happened, and whatever happens now is a different book maybe? Or is this all the same book? And this is where sort of sometimes there's a cosmic brilliance that operates beyond us. Whoever you believe does that. I didn't understand what having the defibrillator was about to cost me personally and within our political system, within our medical system. And so it became clear that like this calculus around when is it the right time to use a device the math was changing as the things that happened to me in the second half of this book happened to me, which namely is that I discover one of my wires is broken, and then we have a surgery that doesn't go particularly well. And I struggle to access the specialist that I need in order to take care of that. So yeah, I would say during the first bit of writing, I was also writing a lot of other things because I was a student getting assignments. I was really trying to work on the skills I would need. How do you think out loud on the page? How do you pace something so that you're not losing readers in the play-by-play of like a lot of hospital visits? How do you use syntax to create feeling inside people at certain points so that the story sort of coils up and releases at different points? So I graduated in December 2014, and then I really entered a stage of trying to push the manuscript forward from 2015 to 2017. And something really fortuitous happened. So in terms of my agenting journey, I can't necessarily say this is a path you can follow if you're a writer, but I wrote an essay in college that won the Iowa Review Award in Nonfiction in May of 2015. And then because it was published in December of 2015, it was eligible and then selected for the Best American Essays 2016. And once you have work in Best American Essays, you kind of have a golden ticket, especially if you're young and you haven't debuted, you know, like that's what the industry sort of has a frenzy over. And I had some agents swirling. So the primary source research that took me to Madagascar and South Africa for this project was paid for by a Kickstarter project in 2014. I raised about $17,000 in 20 days to be able to go to those two places, and then also the Hamilton, Texas trip where I tracked down my great-great-grandmother. So I had some agents swirl when I funded that project. I had some agents swirl when I published in different literary journals that were well regarded. When I won the contest, I got some more, and they just weren't the right people, and the project wasn't well formed enough. I kept trying to work toward a book proposal and was like, this is not ready. I need more time. I don't know how to do this. I thought about taking classes on book proposals because agents would be like, okay, well, send me something when you have it. And I would be like, how am I gonna do that?
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, and so the crazy thing that happened was I found out that I was gonna be in Best American Essays, I think 2 days before I had the surgery where we found out my wire was broken. So I like to joke that every time God does something mean to me, he also gives me a promotion. Because then I was in the intensity of trying to survive this next round of medical things. But I also was all of a sudden having editors at the big houses in New York circling and people really interested in me. So in late 2016, I was trying really hard to work on a book proposal. In early 2017, you know, if you've read the book, you know, I got hit by a car and then got like broken up with and was trying to access care from these specialists and couldn't get there. And then I badly sprained my ankle while I was getting around only on bike and bartending for a living. And so it just was insane. And I was not getting anything done on this book proposal. And this one editor at Simon & Schuster circled back to me and was like, what if I just send emails to agents on your behalf? And I was like, great.
That's nice.
I know. He's hooked me up with several. And one of them was Bonnie Nadell, who represents me now, who was Rebecca Solnit's agent at the time and David Foster Wallace's agent previously. He's no longer with us if you don't know him. So she, I guess, is still his agent in terms of representing his works, but he's not here. And so, yeah, Bonnie was really respectful in the spring of 2017 when I was trying to get the care I needed and navigating a healthcare crisis. And later that summer, she was sort of like, hello. And she said to me, I want to sell your book in October, so we need to do this. And she basically carried me. She went back through these published essays and random drafts of things. I just had stuff everywhere. She went back and she was like, what if we put this line here and this line here and this line here? And it was a total Frankenstein thing, but she gave me enough that then I could begin smoothing it and editing it. And I got my first writing residency ever. I had applied for 17 and I finally got one at the Mesa Refuge in Point Reyes, California. And it was 10 days long. And it was like, you got to go finish this thing. So I wrote my book proposal there and we did some revisions over the fall, but I was bartending and doing journalism, just really crazy. And she sold it in November of 2017. And so then that was this big threshold where I had some advance money to support some of the research I still had to do to pay back some of my medical debt that I'd been carrying. And so I quit my bartending job and I taught a little bit, but I mostly transitioned into working on the book and actually subletted my house for most of the fall of 2018 and the spring of 2019 so that I could be at writing residencies and on research trips. And then the book was really late. I ran out of money. I was like, it was such a traumatic book to write that I had a very hard time working. Like I teach illness writing, trauma writing, and sex writing, and I work with individual clients. And it was just really hard to be there and do the logistics of that. And also be sort of in the underworld, writing about these surgeries and writing about facing death and writing about, losing my partner, going septic, like just all these things. And so, yeah, the end was really hard, really a slog. I'm still a little bit wrung out and trying to figure out like what it means to live after writing Lightning Flowers. So I would say that there was sort of a middle period where I was dealing with life more than writing, but the things I were living were the book. And so there was an interesting layer there of like the artist part of my brain was taking attention. And as I mentioned before, sort of squirreling away scraps of things, paying attention to like, which medical records are we going to need? Like, what do I need to be chronicling that's not just the horror of things? Like there's a scene in the book right before I have a surgery where I go for a walk and I see an owl. And writing memoir, it's just so important if you're writing about intense stuff to have these other pieces of like, What does it mean to live in that body other than just like high alert all the time? So yeah, that's kind of a long answer to that.
Yeah. Do you feel like the book was kind of a distraction for you when all of this horrible things the last, 8 years are happening to you? Do you feel like it was kind of a distraction because you're like, well, I'm going to write a book about this later, or I chronicle this, and then maybe one day I'll use it, or, do you think that was like kind of a coping mechanism for you in a way? It's a little psychology, I guess, popped out of my head.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was definitely a weird period in 2013 before things got dramatic again, where every time I went to the doctor, I would be like, am I supposed to be taking notes on this? Like, it seems like it could be mundane, but will I need it? The kind of anxiety of like, will I have what I need? Will I be able to recreate what I need to recreate? Not knowing, when you're in the middle of living a story, you don't always know what's important. Although the longer I lived this one, the more I understood. But I would say, no, it wasn't a distraction. To be completely frank, this book was my will to live. This book was my will to live. So as someone who had grown up her entire life knowing she would be a writer and who really thought she might die, this was like, there are points in living what I lived that it was like, well, why would I even waste my time working on this big, hard thing when I'm not going to live long enough to complete it anyway?
Right.
Like to be in proximity to death. Paul Kalanithi writes about this really beautifully in When Breath Becomes Air. He talks about how if you know your horizon is 2 years, you know how to live. You know what you want to spend the next 2 years doing. And you know at what rate your body might decline. For him, it was brain cancer. So there was a little bit more of that charted decline that is not a part of my story. But if your horizon is 2 weeks, you live very differently. You don't try to finish your book. You just hang out with your family. Maybe you eat ice cream. You like go to see that beautiful place one last time. Like your priorities change based on how much time you have. And I think part of why COVID has been so destabilizing for people is that we don't have a horizon. There's sort of like, well, can I put it on the calendar? Can I look forward to anything? Should I be living for today? Should I be living still as though we have 30 years? Like, how do I regulate myself? And that was my experience with the book. Like sometimes an intense nihilism of like, this is not important and I can't do anything. But then also when you have lived in proximity to death and you're terrified of your own body, you're in a political system where you feel like you're about to lose access to care for that body, and may never get it back, right? And have already been in the place where you don't have insurance on the day you need it. Like that was so profoundly traumatic for me because I had literally already lived that story. And it was like, seriously? But, I am childless. I am not partnered, especially once my relationship to Tucson started to loosen. My landlord ended up selling my house at the end of my year of subletting. And so I became really unmoored. And it just was like, my whole life is writing this thing. And like, I don't have a normal job I show up to. I just try to figure out how to make what I've been through worth it. And I think, honestly, as a writer, a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is, have I learned enough about that? And what have I learned about that that can be of service? Because I think a lot of us, in a moment of COVID, coming out of COVID, having sort of like been in our own heads with not a lot else going on, there are these questions about like, what does it mean to have a life? And what does it mean to do your own life well? And so she was not my distraction. She was my whole world. And it's been a very bizarre process. It's kind of like being an empty nester.
Yeah. Yeah. What do I do now? Yeah.
A lot of events.
Yeah.
So far, that's the plan.
Well, Matthew had a follow-up question. He said, that's a crazy story behind your book actually getting into publication. I'm glad that your obstacles didn't keep you I'm glad that your obstacles didn't keep it from coming into existence. And then he asked, do you have any other books in the works? Which is a question I was going to ask you too.
Yeah, I certainly will. I'm just built as an author, and I'm happy to finally be here. the things I was working on before I sold Lightning Flowers, there was a book I was working on alongside it that was about sexuality. So in this book, I refer briefly to how I ended up with a job at a sexuality health center and was teaching sex ed all over Colorado and running a clinic for young people. And so there's a lot there that I'm really, the way I had been thinking about it in 2017, the last time I worked on it, I think I'm transformed. And so I can't just step back into the same boots. And so I have to kind of figure out what my relationship to it is. As an older version of myself, a lot of what I'm noticing is that part of the reason I was able to take a job in the realm of sexuality, which, you know, I'm sure everybody listening knows not everybody would be comfortable working in that realm, but also then having something to say myself really came out of the fact of having been ill as a young person and this sense of having to be embodied, knowing that there's not a separation between me and my body, my sensations, my intuitions, my desires, and having to come to know what my body knows and really believe that I know what I know and then actually speak about it. You know, Lightning Flowers is full of instances in which I have to sort of like know what my body is telling me and actually be quite belligerent. It's like not welcome, you know, in the ER when I'm like, something is wrong, listen to me, don't discharge me. And you know, I almost die of severe sepsis. So that process, when you think about a young person then getting discharged from the hospital for the last time and her partner ending the relationship, and then she's working at a sexual health clinic, this question of like, what is it that gives us sovereignty in our bodies? What is it that actually gives us the ability to hear what we want and to believe that what we want is valid, or to ask ourselves more explicitly the question of how what we want is valid or not, and to speak about it to other people? You know, whether you're talking about casual relationships or long-term relationships, this sense of like knowing what's happening for you and talking about it. That's not like obviously a book proposal right there that I just gave you. So there's a lot more to work out in that concept. And I'm sure I'll also be writing about the question that I just recently shared a few minutes ago about like, what does it mean to live past horrible things? Like, what does it mean to have a life and actually live well and transition back out of surviving into something else? So yeah, I think I need to live my way into those questions a little bit, but certainly there will be more books.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I know the book kind of ends with you you know, a doctor telling you, I don't know if you even needed this device in the first place. You know, and then you still have the wire that's still attached to your heart. And I wondered, and I'm sure COVID has messed all kinds of stuff up for you, you know, in the medical world. But I was curious, you know, where are you at in that journey? Have you, you know, had the wire taken out, or, you know, do you have to have the ICD at all? I don't know.
Yeah, there's
talking about.
And there's, back to Matthew's question, there's the tension between the living and the project. I thought I couldn't finish this book until my device was out because I thought that was the ending. And I couldn't get back to Mayo Clinic. I tried so hard. I changed doctors. I had a lot of different strategies and it never worked, you know, between, you know, the doctor who really would have sent me to Mayo, I was seeing her through Arizona's Medicaid program, and Mayo doesn't take out-of-state Medicaid. When I wasn't on the Medicaid expansion portion of the Affordable Care Act and had just a normal ACA plan, I obviously couldn't work with Dr. Garrick and his team anymore. That was not going to be supportive going forward. And so there was only one other cardiology practice I could be in Tucson that was covered by that insurance. That was the only insurance I could access. So this is where the restriction of the network really matters. So at that practice, they basically said, like, if you surveyed all electrophysiologists, how many would say you need an ICD? I'm sure all of them. I'm sure basically all of them. It felt like an ego contest with Dr. Ackerman, that they didn't want to admit that someone else might have more up-to-date research for them, or a different way of crunching the problem that would come to a different solution. They were like, basically, you're fine, and it's unethical for us to take this thing out. or to even help you access specialists. Like you don't need specialists, you're fine with
I
us.
see. So they kind of refused to even take it out.
Yeah. And then I didn't have money to pay out of pocket to just go to the Mayo Clinic. So I never went back. I actually just talked to Dr. Ackerman for the first time since the scenes in the book last week when I did a live event with him through this Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndromes Foundation. So yeah, it was very painful. I like sent him a letter at one point that I don't think he ever got. I've been emailing with Dr. Ray since the book came out, who's just the greatest. And he says he has ways of getting people in and supported. So the real question has been like, is there any urgency around taking it out? And I do not like that I still have 2 live wires growing into my heart in addition to the shard. I do not, it is my fierce gut level feeling that I do not need this device. And I just found out I have 5 more years of battery life. So just let it run down is like going to be a little bit of time still. But it's the questions as I articulated them in the book really still stand. It's like, what is it that makes you undergo life-threatening surgeries when there's not an urgency today? And COVID was terrifying for me because one of the complications people were dying of often was sepsis. And with this shard in my heart, I would not survive sepsis unless they got it out. But I also wasn't in some kind of emergent situation where they needed to try to get it out. So I just really have hunkered down for the last year and been very careful. And now I actually have connected with a cardiologist for the first time since 2017, who I actually trust, who's local, who I can see on my insurance. And then I'm emailing with Dr. Ackerman and Ray now as kind of a professional. So I feel at least supported and like I can get the medical advice I need, but I do live with it every day and I don't love that. And yeah, I'll always sort of question, like, was what I felt anxiety, was what I felt the pulled pectoral, or is it like something's happening in my heart? Like probably nothing's happening in your heart, but, and I should
don't
say
know. Yeah.
that this book coming out has been incredibly validating in that I think I thought I might be like raining on everybody else's ICD parade. Like everybody loves their technology except Katie, who happens to be on the short end. And instead, I've heard from all these people who have technology stuck in their body, whose valves got trashed, who one girl took 70 shocks in a day at age 9.
Wow.
You know, like this stuff, I couldn't even have made that up. And so it's validating, but then that's horrifying also. And I've heard from some people who are real horror stories with a similar scenario to me who are having the valve replacement surgery now because of defibrillator wires. So yeah, this tension that the book talks about is, I think, going to be my reality forever. And it's all of our reality to have to live despite the fact of death. Like that's just true and human. It's just more, it's just conscious for me in a way I don't think it has to be for most folks.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think so. It's a little more on the forefront of your mind and a higher possibility, I suppose, than your average person. Yeah. Well, thank you, Kate. This has been so good. And we've been talking for a little over an hour, so we've probably taken enough of your time. But if anyone wanted to buy your book or to, find you online, where can they go?
Yeah, great. So my website is katherinestandefer.com, and I have classes and other events listed there. There's plenty coming up. And my social media accounts on Instagram and Twitter, I'm Girl Makes Fire. And then there's a Facebook author page under Katherine E. Standefer. And in terms of buying my book, this book is about ethical supply chains. And I know there are always Amazon fans on every call, but if you're willing to support an independent bookstore, I really encourage you to. They really need our help during the pandemic because of the decreased traffic. And if you're interested in a signed copy, and I do personalized inscriptions, you can order from my local bookstore, which is called Collected Works here in Santa Fe. And actually today only, they're doing a 15% off sale for everything to celebrate 1 year of being closed in the pandemic. So if you do want a signed copy, book it today because you'll get a little discount. And then, you know, if you want it signed to someone, you can say that, and I go in every couple of weeks and do all the books. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah. Do you have time for one more question? Because someone,
Sure.
right as I said, whoa. Eileen says, do you have any reservations about the surgery to remove the device just because of your experiences of the dangers of sepsis and everything?
Yeah, I do. I'm very aware, you know, one of the takeaways of this book is that is to be leery of anything that sounds like a fix, that there will be unintended consequences to really anything we do. I actually, in sociology, when I was an undergrad, I think they called this structuration. And it was the concept that because every action includes unacknowledged conditions of action, you will always get unexpected consequences of the action. But there's always just something else in the mix that you don't know about. And I'm very aware at this point that I think part of why that surgery does need to be emergent is I know that it could cause more trouble than it solves, depending on what happens. And there's a way in this book that people keep being like, oh, you'll be fine, it'll be routine. And it's not for me. I don't know if things are routine for other people on the call. Maybe that's a real thing. But for me, it's like, you can't even imagine the way that this might blow up. So make sure you're responding to threats that are present truly as much as you can versus like doing the sort of insurance plan against the future thing. You know, one of the things that's happened since I turned in the copy edits for this book, I had so much embodied trauma from that second surgery and just from carrying the weight of my relationship to death. And my feet stopped working for a while. My hips stopped working for a while. I gained a ton of weight, which is not, you know, associated with trauma for everyone. But for me, it was literally like the weight of this story kind of swelling me. I felt like I was a decomposing thing. And I turned in the copy edits for this book and I was free in a certain sense. This weight lifted off of me. And so in the book, I talk about loving to run and how I couldn't run and then I could run again. And I didn't know if I would get it back. And I really lost that for, I don't know, most of 4 years. There were a few times it sort of like flickered up and then I would have some other trauma related problems and not have access to that particular form of joy. So I was ready to have lost it for good. And in January, I ran 9 miles straight for the first time since before the 2016 surgeries. So I think for me, I'm aware of like what is good right now. And if I have a surgery, like it might help, or it might just really like put me back in trauma therapy and like make me work with a ton of body workers and not do things that feel good in my body. So yeah, there's a real presence to that of like, am I just wanting to make something go away and that's having the procedure, or is the procedure like, now is the moment?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of trepidation. However, I feel much better now that Dr. Ray is back on my team and I need him to not retire. I don't know, close to 70. And there's a big difference between thinking you have to have a procedure when it becomes emergent at some semi-rural hospital, which I love rural, wild places. So that's where I tend to live. And I don't want to have this surgery in Santa Fe after my experiences in Tucson. I want to have this surgery at the Mayo Clinic. So knowing that the ones that are doing it are the ones that can really do it.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
You're fine.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. This has been so great. And I really appreciate, you spending your time with us and talking to us. And yeah, it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, anyone who's watching, I definitely recommend it. And thank you all for attending tonight.
Yeah, thank you everyone for taking your time to be here.